The cruelest sentence Clara Whitmore ever heard was not shouted in anger, but spoken softly enough for every powerful person in the room to enjoy it. Blackthorne Hall glittered above the main coast like a palace carved from storm clouds, its grey stone towers rising over cliffs where the Atlantic struck the rocks with a sound like distant applause. Inside, hundreds of candles burned in silver branches, casting gold over marble floors, dark oil portraits, and gowns that rustled like secrets. The winter charity ball had drawn every important family within 50 miles, from Portland merchants with polished manners to old New England names that carried themselves as if history had personally bowed to them. Clara did not belong among them. She knew it the moment the footman hesitated at the door, the moment two young ladies glanced at her plain gray dress and then at each other, the moment the warmth of the ballroom failed to reach her hands. She had come only to deliver a sealed packet from Mr. Harlan, the estate clerk, a set of ledgers and correspondence marked urgent for His Grace, Duke Everett Blackthorne. Nothing more. She had walked 3 miles through frozen wind because no carriage had been offered to the daughter of a disgraced estate manager, and because duty, unlike pride, could not be abandoned simply because the road was cold. Her boots were clean though worn. Her gloves had been mended twice at the fingers. Her brown hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet, and her face, pale from the weather, held the careful stillness of someone who had learned long ago that tears were expensive things. She crossed the edge of the ballroom with the packet pressed to her chest, hoping to reach the steward unseen. But society had a talent for noticing the vulnerable. Lady Beatrice Harrow turned first, her pearl necklace gleaming against her throat. "Is that Whitmore's girl?" she murmured, though not quietly enough. "The one whose father nearly ruined half the coast?" A thin ripple of laughter moved through the nearest circle. Clara stopped beside a column of black-veined marble. The candles above her trembled, and for a breath, she wished the shadows would open and take her in. Then the crowd parted at the staircase. Duke Everett Blackthorne descended with the grave elegance of a man born above apology. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black evening clothes that made every other gentleman seem overdecorated. His dark hair was brushed back from a stern brow, and his eyes, the color of winter sea glass, found Clara with an expression that revealed nothing except displeasure. The room seemed to arrange itself around him. Even the laughter sharpened into silence. Clara lowered her gaze and curtsied. "Your Grace," she said, "Mr. Harlan asked that these be placed in your hands before morning." The Duke did not take the packet. Instead, he looked from her plain dress to the polished floor beneath her feet, then to the guests watching with hungry attention. "This entrance is for invited company, Miss Whitmore." A faint heat rose into Clara's face. "I apologize, Your Grace. I was told the matter was urgent. There are servants' corridors for such matters." His voice remained controlled, almost bored, and that made it worse. She drew one careful breath. "I meant no disrespect." "No," he said, stepping down the last stair until he stood before her, close enough that she could see the cold precision in his gaze. "I imagine you did not. That is often the trouble with people who forget the boundaries placed for their own protection." A few women smiled behind their fans. Somewhere near the fireplace, a man gave a soft, amused cough. Clara's fingers tightened around the packet, but she did not lower her head further. The Duke's mouth hardened. "Know your place, Miss Whitmore." The words struck the room like a bell. Not loud. Not dramatic. Final. Clara felt the humiliation move over her skin, not as fire, but as ice. Every eye waited for her to crumble, to stammer, to beg forgiveness for standing where polished bloodlines believed she should not stand. She thought of her father's name, spoken for years as though it were a stain. She thought of her mother folding the same pair of gloves by candlelight until the fabric thinned. She thought of all the doors that had closed gently, politely, cruelly. Then Clara lifted her eyes to Everett Blackthorne. For the first time that evening, he seemed faintly surprised by how steady they were. "I have been trying to find it, Your Grace," she said. The ballroom went utterly still. She placed the sealed packet on the nearest silver tray, curtsied once, and turned away before anyone could see how badly her hands had begun to shake. Behind her, Blackthorne Hall resumed its breathing, whispers rising beneath the music like frost spreading across glass. Clara walked through the great doors, past the footmen who no longer met her eyes, and out beneath the portico where the night wind came in from the sea with a clean, merciless bite. Snow had not yet begun to fall, but the air promised it. She pulled her thin cloak tighter and descended the stone steps alone. Above her, the windows of Blackthorne Hall blazed with golden life, each pane filled with movement, laughter, and all the certainty of people who believed the world would always remain exactly as it was. Clara paused only once at the bottom of the drive and looked back. The Duke's silhouette stood briefly against the upper windows, dark and unmoving, as if the house itself had given him shape. She should have hated him then. Perhaps a part of her did. But deeper than hatred, deeper than shame, something quiet took root inside her. Not revenge. Not yet. A vow. One day, she would stand somewhere no one could order her to leave. One day, she would know her place, and it would not be beneath anyone's polished shoe. By the time Clara reached the village road, the music from Blackthorne Hall had softened into a distant shimmer, as if the house were floating somewhere above ordinary suffering. The wind moved hard across the cliff fields, carrying the salt of the Atlantic and the damp chill that came before snow. She kept walking, one hand closed around the edge of her cloak, the other pressed against the place where the sealed packet had rested only minutes before. Her fingers still shook, though she told herself it was from the cold. It was not. Humiliation had a temperature of its own. It lived beneath the skin, white and silent, and it made even the strongest breath feel borrowed. Clara did not look back again. The road from Blackthorne Hall curved downward for nearly 2 miles before reaching the narrow street of Mariner's Hollow, a village of slate roofs, shuttered windows, and lamps that burned low to save oil. By the time she arrived, a fine freezing rain had begun to fall, silvering the cobblestones and turning every lantern into a blurred yellow star. The dressmaker's shop where she rented a small back room stood at the end of the lane. Its sign creaked softly above the door. Clara paused beneath it, gathering what remained of her composure, then slipped through the side entrance. Mrs. Bellamy was waiting in the hallway with a candle in one hand and Clara's valise in the other. That was how Clara knew before a single word was spoken. The older woman's face was not unkind, which somehow made it harder to bear. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "I am sorry." Clara looked at the valise. It had already been packed. Her spare stockings, her mother's comb, the folded black shawl, the little Bible with pressed violets between the pages. All of it reduced to a single worn case. Mrs. Bellamy lowered her voice. Lady Harrow's maid came ahead of the carriage. She said there was unpleasantness at the hall. She said it would be better for my business if I did not keep you here. Better, Clara repeated softly. The word had followed her all her life, dressed in polite excuses. Better not to mention her father. Better not to challenge a rumor. Better not to stand too near people who had the power to decide what decency looked like. Mrs. Bellamy's eyes filled with discomfort. I have daughters to think of. I know, Clara said. And she did know. That was the trouble. Cruelty was easier to hate when it wore a cruel face. This was only fear, ordinary and small, passing itself from hand to hand until it became law. Clara took the valise. Thank you for the room while I had it. You paid honestly, Mrs. Bellamy whispered. Whatever they say, you always paid honestly. Clara gave her a faint smile, the kind one offers when kindness comes too late to be useful, then stepped back into the rain. There was no one that would receive her after word from Blackthorne Hall. She understood that without asking. A woman with a damaged name could survive poverty, but not notice. Notice was the more dangerous thing. She walked toward the old cemetery above the harbor, where the road narrowed between leaning fences and winter-bare elms. Her father was buried there beneath a modest stone that bore only his name, Samuel Whitmore, and the years of his life. No title. No defense. No mention of the accounts he had balanced, the tenants he had helped, the long evenings he spent teaching Clara figures by candlelight. The world had taken his honor first, then his strength, and finally his place among the living. Clara knelt before the stone, though the ground was wet enough to soak through her skirt. "I am sorry, Papa," she whispered. "I tried to stand straight." The rain tapped against the bare branches overhead. For one fragile moment, she allowed her forehead to rest against her clasped hands. Not a sob. Not surrender. Only the exhaustion of a young woman who had spent years being brave in rooms where bravery had no audience. A lantern glow appeared beyond the cemetery gate. Clara rose quickly, wiping her face with the back of her glove. An elderly gentleman stood beside a hired carriage, his dark coat beaded with rain, his silver hair hidden beneath a low hat. "Miss Clara Whitmore?" he asked. His voice was careful, formal, touched by urgency. Clara tightened her grip on the valise. "I am Clara Whitmore." He removed his hat. "My name is Alden Price. I was once solicitor to your grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore of Rosevale." The name moved through Clara like the sound of a door opening in a house she had believed empty. "My grandmother died before I was born." "So many believed," Mr. Price said, glancing toward the road as though the darkness itself might be listening. "But belief and truth are rarely the same thing in matters of land." From inside his coat, he withdrew a long envelope sealed with dark red wax. The mark pressed into it was not familiar, yet Clara felt, impossibly, that it had been waiting for her all her life. "Your mother instructed me to find you when the last witness passed," he said. "That happened 3 days ago." Clara stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it. "What is this?" Mr. Price held it out. "A map, a will, and the beginning of an answer your father died without being allowed to give." The rain thickened around them. Behind Clara, her father's grave stood silent. Ahead, the carriage door waited open, its lanterns swinging in the wind. Clara took the envelope at last, and the wax was cold beneath her thumb, as cold as the words spoken in Blackthorne Hall, yet far heavier with promise. Mr. Alden Price did not take Clara to an inn, nor back toward the village where every window seemed to know her shame. His carriage rolled north along the coastal road, its wheels hissing through wet gravel while the lanterns swung against the dark like small, stubborn moons. Clara sat opposite him with the sealed envelope resting on her lap, both hands placed over it as though it might vanish if she loosened her grip. The interior smelled faintly of leather, rainwater, and old paper. For nearly a mile, either of them spoke. Beyond the glass, the Atlantic appeared and disappeared between black pines, a restless strip of silver under a cloud-thick sky. At last, Mr. Price leaned forward and tapped the envelope with one gloved finger. "You should open it before we reach my office, Miss Whitmore. Some truths are easier to face while the road is still moving." Clara looked at him. "My father was called a thief." Her voice was quiet, but the word carried years inside it. Mr. Price's lined face tightened. "Your father was called many things by people who benefited from his silence. That is not the same as guilt." Clara broke the wax. Inside lay 3 documents wrapped in blue ribbon, brittle at the edges but carefully preserved. The first was a hand-drawn map of the coastal estates, dated 32 years earlier. Blackthorne lands were marked in dark ink across the cliffs and western fields. Beside them, bordered in faded rose, lay a smaller property Clara had heard of only in passing, a neglected place with shuttered windows and dead gardens. Rosevale Estate. Her breath caught when she saw the name written in a woman's elegant hand. "This belonged to my grandmother?" "More than belonged," Mr. Price said. "It was settled upon Eleanor Whitmore by her father before her marriage. It could not legally be sold without her signature and 2 witnesses." Clara looked down at the second paper. It was a deed of transfer, stamped and filed, but there was something wrong with it. The ink of the signature seemed heavier than the rest, awkward where Eleanor's name curved. Clara had copied enough ledgers to know when a hand hesitated. "This is not her writing," she said. "No," Mr. Price replied. "It is not." The carriage passed over a rut, and the lamp flickered. Clara steadied the papers with both hands. "And Blackthorne took it?" "Blackthorne acquired the use of it, Mr. Price said carefully. "A polite phrase for an impolite act." The late Duke claimed the property after your grandmother was declared legally incompetent during her final illness. The papers suggested she consented. They also suggested your father, Samuel Whitmore, as assistant manager at the time, certified the accounts attached to the transfer. Clara's eyes lifted sharply. He would never have done that. He did not. Mr. Price reached into his satchel and produced a smaller folded sheet. I have spent years proving as much. The third document was a letter in Clara's father's handwriting. She recognized the slope of the letters instantly, and the sight of it struck her with a tenderness so sudden she almost closed her eyes. My dear Eleanor, it began, the Roseville accounts have been altered. The boundary rents from the Eastern Road have been diverted into Blackthorne ledgers under false designation. I fear the transfer was not merely improper, but deliberate. Clara read the lines twice, then a third time, each word placing a stone in a foundation she had not known she was standing upon. The Eastern Road, she whispered. Mr. Price nodded. The old carriage road from the cliffs to Barrow Harbor. These days, every shipment from Blackthorne Hall uses it when the main turnpike freezes or floods. It crosses Rosevale land for almost 2 miles. Clara thought of Everett Blackthorne descending that marble staircase as if the earth itself had been arranged beneath his feet. She thought of the cold certainty in his face, the guests smiling as though her humiliation had been part of the evening's entertainment. Does the current Duke know? She asked. Mr. Price looked out at the rain-dark road. That is a dangerous question. Clara understood what he did not say. A man might inherit land without inheriting every sin that secured it, but he also inherited the comfort those sins purchased. The carriage slowed before a narrow brick building near the harbor, its windows lit despite the late hour. Mr. Price helped her down, then led her through a side door into an office crowded with cabinets, maps, and shelves of county records. A coal stove glowed in the corner. On the desk lay a large iron key, black with age, attached to a tag written in the same elegant hand as the map. Rosevale. Clara stared at it. It looked too small to alter a life. Your mother came to me before she died, Mr. Price said behind her. She had little money, but she had patience. She asked me to wait until the last man who signed those papers could no longer interfere. He passed 3 days ago in Boston. The claim can now be filed without obstruction. Clara did not move. The room was warm, yet she felt the cold of the cemetery still clinging to her skirt. If this is true, why did no one tell me before tonight? Because truth without timing is easily buried, Mr. Price said. And because your father wanted to clear the name before placing the burden on you. He never had the chance. Clara touched the key. Her fingers closed around it slowly. For years she had believed she owned nothing but a damaged name and the manners her mother insisted poverty could not take away. Now an estate waited in the darkness, neglected, wounded, and legally hers. Not a gift. Not charity. A place stolen from her family and returned by paper, patience, and the dead who refused to stay silent. Outside, the rain softened to mist. Somewhere beyond the town, Blackthorne Hall burned with golden windows on its cliff. But beside it, hidden behind locked gates and winter-stripped trees, Rosevale was waiting for its mistress to come home. For 3 months, Clara Whitmore lived as though silence itself had become her teacher. She did not return to Mariner's Hollow. She did not pass beneath the bright windows of Blackthorne Hall. She did not answer the one brief note Mrs. Bellamy sent to Mr. Price's office, apologizing in careful phrases that asked for forgiveness without risking anything to earn it. Instead, Clara went south to Portland, where the harbor smelled of coal smoke, salt water, wet rope, and ambition. Mr. Price arranged a narrow room for her above a widow's stationery shop on Congress Street, its single window facing a brick wall only 12 feet away. The room was plain, but it had a lock, a small iron stove, and a table just wide enough for books, ledgers, and the future. Every morning before sunrise, Clara walked to Mr. Price's office with her collar turned up against the wind. Every evening she returned with ink on her fingers and numbers moving behind her tired eyes. She learned the language of deeds, easements, boundary rights, probate filings, and county plats. She learned that land could be stolen politely, with ribboned documents and respectable signatures. She learned that cruelty did not always enter by force. Sometimes it came through a clerk's pen, a sealed envelope, a gentleman's nod across a polished table. Mr. Price taught her patiently, but never gently. If you are to hold Rosevale, he told her one grey morning, you must understand every inch of what they will try to take from you. So Clara understood. She traced the eastern road again and again until she could have drawn it from memory, from the broken gate near the poplar line to the steep descent toward Barrow Harbor. Nearly 2 miles of passage across Rosevale land. 2 miles Blackthorne had used for years as if custom were ownership. At night, when the wind pressed against the glass, she read her father's letter until the paper softened at the folds. She did not weep over it often. Grief had become too disciplined for that. But sometimes, when the lamps were low and the city bells struck midnight, Clara touched the familiar handwriting and whispered, I am listening now. To restore Rosevale, she needed money she did not have. Her mother's garnet brooch was sold first, then the pearl earrings wrapped in blue silk since Clara's childhood, then a small gold locket containing a faded curl of hair. Each sale felt like loosening her hold on the dead, but she told herself the dead had not given her these things to keep her poor. They had given them so she might survive with her dignity intact. Mr. Price found a contractor willing to work quietly. Mrs. Lydia Crane, a widowed housekeeper with sharp eyes and a sharper sense of fairness, agreed to hire a skeleton staff. A gardener from Cape Elizabeth took one look at the ruined glasshouse in the old drawings, and said the roses might live again if someone had the courage to cut away what was dead. That sentence stayed with Clara longer than he knew. By the second month, letters arrived from Rosevale reporting progress. The front steps cleared of moss. The roof patched above the west wing. 12 windows replaced along the south gallery. Chimneys opened. Floors scrubbed until the original oak shone through years of dust. The old well tested clean. The iron gates lifted back onto their hinges. Clara kept each report folded in her desk, a quiet stack of proof that a house could be wounded and still return to itself. Yet restoration did not make her heart hard in the way she had feared. She had imagined revenge would taste like sweetness. Instead, she found no appetite for it. What she wanted was not to see Everett Blackthorne humbled for sport. She wanted the truth set upright, like a chair knocked over in a room everyone had pretended not to notice. Once, near the end of the 3rd month, she saw his name printed in the Portland Gazette beneath a notice about coastal shipping delays and estate debts. Blackthorne Freight, it said, had suffered losses from late winter storms along the turnpike. Clara stared at the line for a long while. The power that had seemed untouchable beneath candlelight was, like every old house, dependent on roads, weather, ledgers, and the obedience of those it overlooked. On the morning Mr. Price filed the final papers at the Cumberland County Courthouse, snow fell softly over Portland, turning the streets white and soundless. Clara stood beside him in a dark blue dress Mrs. Crane had insisted was suitable for a landowner, though Clara still felt like a stranger inside the word. The clerk stamped the document, sanded the ink, and slid it back across the counter. There was no music. No applause. No thunder from the heavens. Only a seal pressed into paper and a legal sentence that restored what whispers had tried to erase. Miss Clara Whitmore, lawful owner of Rosevale Estate. Mr. Price watched her read it. Are you ready to go home? He asked. Clara folded the document with steady hands. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that one woman's life had changed its shape. She thought of the gray cliffs, the locked gates, the dead roses, and the golden windows of Blackthorne Hall watching from the hill next door. Then she lifted her chin. Yes, she said. But not as the girl who left. The road back to the coast seemed shorter than the road that had taken Clara away, though every mile carried the weight of return. By late afternoon, the hired carriage left the last pine dark bend and began its climb along the cliffs north of Mariner's Hollow. The Atlantic stretched below in sheets of iron and silver, restless beneath a pale March sky. Wind moved through the dry grass beside the road, bending it all in one direction, as if the land itself were leaning toward Rosevale. Clara sat upright with the deed folded inside her reticule and the old iron key wrapped in a handkerchief upon her lap. She wore the dark blue dress from Portland, a plain wool cloak, and white gloves Mrs. Crane had pressed that morning until they looked almost new. Nothing about her was extravagant. That comforted her. She had not returned dressed as a lady from a storybook, glittering for the approval of those who once looked away. She had returned as herself, only steadier. When the carriage passed the upper ridge, Blackthorne Hall appeared first, as it always did, commanding the cliffs with its towers, chimneys, and severe grey walls. Its windows caught the late light like watchful eyes. For a moment, Clara's breath tightened. Memory had its own architecture, and Blackthorne Hall still held the staircase, the candles, the silence after the Duke's words. But the carriage did not turn toward those iron gates. It continued east, along a lane half hidden by winter hedges, until another gate emerged from the mist. Rosevale. The name was worked into the iron arch in letters almost swallowed by ivy, but the hinges had been repaired, and when the driver stepped down, they opened without protest. Clara heard that sound with a force no one else could have understood. Not a creak. Not merely metal moving. A threshold giving way. The carriage rolled through. Beyond the gate, Rosevale Estate rose from its long neglect like a woman waking from a fever. It was smaller than Blackthorne Hall, but more graceful, built of pale stone warmed by age, with green shutters, a wide front porch, and tall windows that looked toward the sea. Patches of snow still lay beneath the hedgerows, but the path had been cleared. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys. Fresh curtains hung behind the glass. In the ruined garden, trimmed rose canes waited like dark promises in the thawing earth. Mrs. Lydia Crane stood at the front steps with 3 servants beside her, all arranged with such solemn care that Clara nearly smiled. "Welcome home, Miss Whitmore," the housekeeper said. The words entered Clara quietly and then spread through her with an ache so deep it felt almost like grief. Home. She stepped down from the carriage and placed one gloved hand on the porch rail. The wood was newly sanded, still smelling faintly of oil and rain. "Thank you, Mrs. Crane," she said. Inside, Rosevale held the tender disorder of restoration. In the entrance hall, polished floors reflected the wavering light of newly lit lamps. Dust sheets had been folded away from the furniture. A cracked mirror above the console had been cleaned until it gave back Clara's face in fragments, then whole. She walked room by room, touching nothing at first. The south parlor with its pale green walls. The library where several shelves still stood empty. The dining room where one long table waited beneath a modest chandelier. Finally, Mrs. Crane led her to the study. On the desk lay the estate ledger, a vase of white winter roses from the greenhouse, and a folded note from Mr. Price. Clara did not open it immediately. She moved to the window instead. From there, across the strip of field and bare trees, Blackthorne Hall stood visible on the neighboring height. Close enough to watch. Close enough to remember. At that same hour, Duke Everett Blackthorne stood on his own western balcony, reviewing a telegram from Barrow Harbor about delayed freight and impassable roads. He had not slept well in weeks. The estate accounts were worsening, though no one beyond his steward knew how badly. Blackthorne Pride had survived wars, scandals, and storms, but Pride could not pay shipping costs, repair washed-out turnpikes, or calm creditors in Boston. He folded the telegram, jaw tight, and looked toward the east only because a motion in the valley caught his eye. Smoke. Rising from Rosevale. For 12 years, that house had been dark. A useless neighboring shell, disputed only in old records and ignored by men who found neglect convenient. Now its chimneys breathed. A carriage stood at the front steps. Servants moved along the porch. Everett narrowed his eyes. "Harlan," he called without turning. His steward stepped onto the balcony. "Your Grace? Who has taken possession of Rosevale?" Harlan went very still. "I received word this morning, Your Grace." The filing was completed in Portland. Everett turned then, the wind lifting the edge of his black coat. "Who?" Harlan swallowed. "Miss Clara Whitmore." For a moment, The only sound was the Atlantic striking the rocks below. Everett looked back across the fields. In the window of Rosevale's study, a woman stood framed by lamplight, slender and still in a dark blue dress. Even at that distance, he knew the angle of her lifted chin. The memory of a grey dress beneath his chandeliers passed through him with unwelcome sharpness. Clara Whitmore did not look toward Blackthorne Hall as a beggar might look toward power. She looked from her own window, in her own house, across her own land. And for the first time in his life, Duke Everett Blackthorne felt the border between their worlds move beneath his feet. By the following morning, the boundary between Rosevale and Blackthorne had become the most important strip of land on the Maine coast. Everett learned this not from rumor, but from ledgers laid open across his study beneath the grey light of dawn. His steward, Mr. Harlan, stood on the opposite side of the desk with the defeated posture of a man carrying numbers he wished belonged to someone else. "The winter storms have damaged the North Turnpike again, Your Grace," he said. "Repairs will take at least 4 weeks, perhaps 6 if the ground stays wet." Everett did not look up. And the harbor freight? Waiting at Barrow Harbor. Timber, wool, and the machinery from Boston. If it does not move inland before the end of the month, storage charges will double. Everett's pen stilled. "Use the eastern road." Harlan's silence answered before his mouth did. Everett raised his eyes. "The eastern road crosses Rosevale land, Your Grace. The new deed gives Miss Whitmore full authority to restrict passage. For years, Blackthorne wagons had taken that road without question, rattling past Rosevale's dead hedges as if neglect itself had granted permission. Custom had become convenience, convenience had become assumption, and assumption had dressed itself in the clothing of right. Everett stood and walked to the window. Across the thawing fields, Rosevale's chimneys breathed steadily into the morning. The sight unsettled him more than ruins ever had. Ruins made no demands. A restored house did. "Send a formal request," he said. Harlan hesitated. "I took the liberty of doing so yesterday evening." "And?" A reply arrived at sunrise. Harlan placed a cream envelope on the desk. Everett recognized the hand only as neat, controlled, and entirely unfamiliar to any woman he had once believed he understood. He broke the seal. "Your Grace, the matter concerns legal access through Rosevale property and must be discussed in person. I will receive you at 11 o'clock. Clara Whitmore." No flourish. No apology. No resentment spilling between the lines. That composure irritated him in a way anger would not have. At 5 minutes before 11, Everett's carriage stopped before Rosevale's front steps. He had not visited the estate since childhood, and memory offered him only a blurred image of shuttered windows and weeds pressing against the glass. Now the house stood awake. The porch had been swept, brass polished, and white curtains lifted in the sea wind. A servant opened the door before Everett could knock. Mrs. Crane received him in the hall with a curtsy so exact it bordered on judgment. "Miss Whitmore is in the study, Your Grace." Everett followed her through rooms warmed by coal fires and the faint fragrance of lemon oil. Nothing was lavish. Everything was deliberate. That troubled him too. Poverty, he could have dismissed. Vulgar display, he could have despised. But order, restraint, and quiet competence left him with no convenient emotion. Clara stood when he entered. She wore a dark green dress, high at the throat and plain except for a narrow white collar. Sunlight from the window rested on her hair and along the edge of the desk where Rosevale's ledgers lay open. She curtsied, not deeply, not defiantly, but with the exact measure courtesy required and no more. "Your Grace." "Miss Whitmore." The air between them held the memory of a ballroom neither named. "Please sit," she said. "We should discuss the road while the weather still allows decisions to matter." Everett looked at the chair opposite her desk. Once she had stood before him in a room arranged to make her small. Now he stood in hers, waiting to be invited into conversation. He sat. Clara did the same and folded her hands over a map of the estate. "The eastern road crosses Rosevale for 1.8 miles, she said. "It has been used by Blackthorne wagons without recorded payment, written easement, or annual agreement for 12 years. Everett's jaw tightened. Blackthorne maintained that road. Partly, Clara replied. Using stone from Roseville quarries and labor billed through Blackthorne accounts after the original transfer. Her eyes lifted to his. I have read the ledgers. The statement was not accusation. It was worse. It was fact. Everett leaned back slowly. You have been thorough. I was taught that women with damaged names must be twice as accurate as men with respected ones. The words entered him quietly, but they did not leave quietly. He remembered the gray dress, the lowered fans, his own voice laying judgment upon a woman whose history he had never cared to investigate. He had expected bitterness. Instead, she offered him precision, and somehow it felt less forgiving. What are your terms? He asked. Clara turned the map toward him. Temporary passage for 30 days. Limited wagon weight to preserve the lower bridge. Written compensation at a fair rate per load. No assumption of future rights. All drivers to remain on the marked road. Everett studied the page. These are business terms. Yes. He looked at her. You do not intend to punish me? At that, something flickered in her face, not softness, not hurt exactly, but the shadow of it. If I wished only to punish you, Your Grace, I would close the gate and let your freight rot at the harbor. The room went still. Then she reached for the teapot beside the ledger and poured into 2 cups with hands that did not tremble. I am not interested in cruelty simply because I have finally been given the legal means to practice it. She placed a cup before him. Please take tea. We should both remember the difference between power and dignity. Everett looked at the cup, then at the woman across from him. The sentence he had once spoken returned with a force that made the fire seem suddenly cold. Clara Whitmore had not raised her voice. She had not demanded an apology. Yet in her quiet room, on her lawful land, she had made him feel the full poverty of his pride. The agreement was signed before noon, yet its ink unsettled Everett long after he returned to Blackthorne Hall. He told himself the discomfort came from necessity. A duke did not enjoy negotiating for a road his household had used unquestioned since before his father's portrait had darkened above the library mantel. A duke did not enjoy seeing his steward relieved by the generosity of a woman society had dismissed only months earlier. But the lie wore thin before evening. It was not necessity that troubled him. It was Clara Whitmore's restraint. She had possessed every reason to close her gates, every reason to make him feel the weather, the waiting freight, the anxious creditors gathering beyond his polished doors. Instead, she had offered terms so fair they became a mirror, and Everett had not liked the man reflected there. That night Blackthorne Hall felt colder than usual, though fires burned in every public room. Everett walked alone through the west corridor, past portraits of stern men in dark coats and pale women whose painted hands rested on velvet chairs. His ancestors looked down with the serene confidence of people who had never expected the ground beneath them to be questioned. At the end of the hall, he entered the old records room, a chamber few visited and no one loved. Dust lay in the corners like gray velvet. Tin document boxes lined the walls. Ledgers, survey rolls, estate maps, tenant receipts, and letters slept under labels written by dead clerks. Everett lit 2 lamps and removed his coat. If Clara had read the records, then he would read them too. He began with the Eastern Road. One ledger led to another, then to a survey dated 12 years before his inheritance, then to a bundle of correspondence tied with black ribbon. Near midnight, rain began to strike the windows. By 1 o'clock, Everett had found his father's handwriting. The late Duke of Blackthorne had written in the same elegant, severe script Everett had seen all his life beneath instructions, judgments, and family prayers. The letter was addressed to Mr. Conrad Vale, the former county registrar. Everett read the first page standing. He read the second sitting down. By the third, his hand had gone still upon the desk. The Whitmore man has become inconvenient, his father had written. He continues to question the Roseville transfer and has discovered the misfiled rents from the Eastern Road. If the matter is allowed to proceed, our position may be embarrassed at the county level. See that his concerns are discredited before they gather sympathy. No admission must be made regarding Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore's signature. Everett did not move. The rain traced silver lines down the glass. Somewhere below, the house clock struck 2, each note spreading through the walls like a verdict. He read the sentence again, though its meaning did not change. Discredited. Not mistaken. Not confused. Discredited. A deliberate word. A gentleman's word for ruin done cleanly. He thought of Samuel Whitmore's grave somewhere above the harbor, modest and likely weather-stained. He thought of Clara standing in his ballroom with every cruel whisper of that old lie clinging to her dress. He had not invented the injustice. That would have been an easier guilt. He had inherited it, benefited from it, repeated it, and called it order. The next morning, Everett rode to Rosevale under a pale sky washed clean by rain. He should have sent a note. Propriety demanded it. Pride might once have insisted upon it. But shame had its own urgency. He found Clara in the lower garden with Mrs. Crane and the gardener, examining the damaged glasshouse. She wore a grey cloak against the wind, and a few loose strands of hair moved against her cheek. At his approach, the others stepped back. Clara turned, surprise passing over her face before she composed it. "Your Grace." "Miss Whitmore." He removed his hat. "Forgive the intrusion." She studied him, not coldly, but carefully. "Is there trouble with the road?" "No." His fingers tightened around the leather folder in his hand. "There is trouble with the truth." Clara did not answer. The garden around them held its breath, all trim thorns, damp soil, and the faint green scent of things not yet blooming. Everett opened the folder and offered her the letter. "I found this in my father's records. I believe it concerns yours." Clara took it. As she read, color left her face slowly, not in weakness, but in the terrible recognition of a wound finally given its proper name. Her father had not failed. He had been made to look as though he had. The silence lengthened until Everett could hear the sea beyond the fields. "I am sorry," he said. The words were insufficient the moment they left him. Clara's eyes remained on the page. "Are you sorry because it is true, or because I now have proof?" The question struck with quiet accuracy. Everett accepted it. "Both, perhaps. But more because I stood in a room full of people and added my voice to a lie already old enough to have buried a decent man." Clara folded the letter with care, as though even painful truth deserved gentleness. "My father used to say accounts never forgive. They only wait to be balanced." Everett looked toward the broken glasshouse, the repaired windows, the house behind her rising from neglect by force of patience rather than noise. "Then let me help balance them." For the first time, something like anger flashed in Clara's eyes, bright and controlled. "I do not need rescue, Your Grace." He bowed his head. "No. You do not." That was the first true thing he had said to her without defense. When he looked up again, his voice had changed. "Then allow me to bear witness." Clara held his gaze for a long moment. Between them stood a dead father, a stolen estate, a cruel ballroom, and the fragile beginning of a different kind of reckoning. At last she slipped the letter into her reticule. "Witnesses are useful," she said softly, "but only if they speak when silence would profit them more." Everett understood. The next time the room turned against her, he would have to decide whether his honor was merely a family inheritance, or something he was willing to earn. The invitation to Wycliffe Assembly House arrived on cream paper edged in gold, as if elegance could soften the insult written between its lines. Clara read it in the Rosevale study while morning light moved across the ledger table and the sea wind pressed gently at the windows. The coastal landowners of Cumberland County requested her presence at a special meeting regarding the future stability of regional estates, trade roads, and harbor access. No accusation appeared on the page. No command. Yet Clara heard both clearly. Mrs. Crane stood near the door with a tray of tea, her expression severe. "They mean to corner you." Clara folded the invitation once, then again. "Yes." Mr. Price, seated beside the fire with his spectacles low on his nose, gave a grim nod. "They will argue that Rosevale is too important to be held by an inexperienced woman." They will speak of commerce, tradition, the welfare of tenants, anything except the fact that they dislike seeing property in hands they cannot control. Clara looked through the window toward the bare fields where the eastern road curved between Rosevale and Blackthorne. For weeks, Blackthorne wagons had passed according to her terms, slower than before, weighed properly, recorded honestly. Nothing had collapsed. No tenant had suffered. No harbor had starved. Yet peace made certain people restless when it proved they had never needed to be obeyed. "Will the Duke attend?" she asked. Mr. Price hesitated. "He has been summoned. His position will matter." Of course it would. Everett Blackthorne's silence had once strengthened a room against her. His voice could do the same again. Clara placed the invitation on the desk and rested her fingertips upon it. She thought of his face in the garden when he handed her the letter, the first true shame she had seen in him. But remorse in private was a candle. Public truth was a fire. Many men admired candles because they could be extinguished quietly. On the day of the meeting, the sky hung low and white above the coast. Clara wore a dark violet wool dress with no ornament except her mother's plain silver pin at the collar. Mrs. Crane insisted on accompanying her as far as the carriage steps, smoothing the cloak at Clara's shoulders with hands that trembled despite her stern mouth. "Hold your head as you did when you first crossed this threshold," she said. Clara almost smiled. "I was terrified then." "Most courage is," Mrs. Crane replied. "It simply has good posture." Wycliffe Assembly House stood 5 miles inland, a brick building with tall windows, white columns, and a reputation for respectability polished by generations of men congratulating one another beneath its roof. When Clara entered, conversations thinned but did not stop. That was worse. She saw Lady Beatrice Harrow near the front, pale feathers trembling in her hat. Mr. Conrad Vale's nephew stood by the mantel, avoiding her eyes. Several landowners turned to inspect her as they might inspect a parcel offered at auction. Everett was already there, standing near the far window in a black coat, his face unreadable. Their eyes met across the room. He bowed. Not deeply, but not carelessly. Clara returned the gesture and took the chair Mr. Price indicated beside her. The meeting began with courteous poison. Mr. Jonathan Wycliffe, chairman of the association, spoke of roads, weather, regional prosperity, and the delicate balance that had long preserved harmony among the coastal estates. Clara listened without expression. Harmony, she had learned, was often the name powerful people gave to arrangements that favored them. At last, Mr. Wycliffe turned toward her with a smile too polished to hold warmth. "Miss Whitmore, no one here questions the legal filing that placed Rosevale in your name." Clara noticed the word filing, not inheritance. However, Rosevale's position beside Blackthorne Hall, and particularly its control over the eastern road, creates a difficulty beyond personal ownership. "Personal ownership is the basis of land law," Mr. Price said evenly. Several men shifted. Lady Harrow sighed. "Surely we are not here to debate technicalities. Miss Whitmore is young. She has no husband, no established household lineage, no long experience managing the obligations of a coastal estate. We must consider whether sentiment has placed too much responsibility upon her." Clara felt the old chill move through the room. Different walls. Same appetite. Mr. Wycliffe opened a document. "A proposal has been prepared. Blackthorne Hall would purchase Rosevale at a generous price, preserve your comfort, and restore administrative unity to the neighboring lands. Many here believe this is the wisest outcome." Clara looked at Everett. Every face turned subtly toward him, waiting for the natural order to reassert itself. His expression remained still, but one hand tightened around the back of the chair before him. Then a gray-haired gentleman Clara did not know leaned back and said with careless finality, "Miss Whitmore should understand that every person has a proper station." The words fell softly, and a few quiet laughs followed. Clara's throat tightened, not because the insult was new, but because the wound remembered being made. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She would not tremble for them. Mr. Wycliffe glanced toward Everett. "Your Grace, given Blackthorne's historical interest, perhaps you will speak." Everett opened the leather folder, and the room seemed to lean toward it. Clara heard the small sounds people make when they expect power to protect itself, the faint scrape of a chair, the rustle of silk, the satisfied breath of those who believed the ending had already been written. Mr. Wycliffe smiled as if Everett's first words would seal Rosevale back into the hands that wanted it. Instead, Everett laid a yellowed letter on the table. "This document was found in the private records room at Blackthorne Hall," he said. "It was written by my father to the former county registrar concerning Rosevale Estate, the Eastern Road, and Samuel Whitmore." At the mention of her father's name, Clara felt the room shift. Not soften. Never that. But sharpen. Lady Harrow's fan stopped moving. Mr. Wycliffe's smile thinned. Everett continued, each word measured, not dramatic, not pleading, but clean as a blade of winter light. "The letter confirms that Mr. Whitmore questioned the transfer of Rosevale and the diversion of rents from the Eastern Road. It also confirms that efforts were made to discredit him before his claims could be heard." A murmur rose, then broke apart when Everett placed a second page beside the first. "This is a comparison of Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore's verified signature and the signature used on the transfer document. I am not a court, gentlemen, but I am no longer willing to pretend I cannot see what is before me." Mr. Wycliffe stood too quickly. "Your Grace, old documents are delicate matters." "Precisely," Everett said. "Which is why they should not be handled by convenience." The silence that followed was different from the silence in Blackthorne Hall months earlier. That silence had waited for Clara to be diminished. This one waited for certain men to decide whether they could survive being seen. Clara sat very still. Her hands were folded in her lap, but inside her chest, something long imprisoned had risen to its feet. Everett turned slightly, not enough to make a spectacle of her, only enough to make clear that she was not the subject of their permission. "Miss Whitmore owns Rosevale by lawful inheritance, by documented claim, and by the failure of dishonest men to bury truth forever. Blackthorne Hall has used the Eastern Road without proper agreement for years. That ended when she chose fairness where others might have chosen vengeance." A color touched Mr. Wycliffe's neck. "Surely you do not mean to damage your own house over a misunderstanding?" Everett looked at him then, and for the first time that day, the old ducal coldness served something better than pride. "My house was damaged before I was born. I am only refusing to decorate the crack." No one laughed. Clara looked down, not because she was weak, but because the sound that almost escaped her was too close to grief. Her father had waited years for one respected voice to say he had not been the liar. He was not alive to hear it, and that truth would always ache. Yet the ache had changed. It no longer bent her. It named what had bent her, and naming was its own form of mercy. Lady Harrow rose with a brittle smile. "This is highly irregular." "No," Mr. Price said from beside Clara, removing his spectacles with deliberate care. "What was irregular was the theft. This is merely late." The words passed through the assembly like a match through dry paper. One by one, men who had arrived ready to pressure Clara began studying the floor, the windows, their cuffs, anything except her face. Mr. Wycliffe lowered himself back into his chair. "The proposal to purchase Rosevale," he said hoarsely, "appears to require reconsideration." "It does not," Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. "I decline it entirely." The room turned toward her. She rose, smoothing one gloved hand over her violet skirt. "Rosevale will not be sold to Blackthorne Hall or to any gentleman who believes a woman's inexperience is easier to discuss than a family's endurance. The Eastern Road will remain open under written agreement, because commerce matters, tenants matter, and fairness matters. But let no one mistake fairness for surrender." She paused. "My father was Samuel Whitmore. He was honest. My grandmother was Eleanor Whitmore. Rosevale was hers. Now it is mine." Each sentence settled into the room like stone placed carefully in a wall that would stand. Everett bowed his head, not as a man granting approval, but as one acknowledging a truth that had never needed him to create it. "I once spoke to Miss Whitmore in a manner beneath any gentleman," he said. "I will not repeat those words here. They deserved to die where they were born, in ignorance. Then he looked at Clara fully. I was wrong. Your place was never beneath mine. It never belonged to me to define. Clara held his gaze. There was no triumph in her face, no easy forgiveness offered for the comfort of witnesses. Only dignity, bruised and bright, standing at last in a room that could not dismiss it. Then perhaps, Your Grace, she said softly, this is where truth begins. By sunset, the carriages left Wycliffe Assembly House under a sky washed pale gold above the thawing fields. Clara returned to Rosevale with Mr. Price beside her, and the old letters secured in her satchel. Across the valley, Blackthorne Hall caught the same evening light, its windows no longer seeming like eyes, but like questions. In the weeks that followed, the Eastern Road was repaired properly, the agreement was recorded at the county office, and Samuel Whitmore's name was restored in the ledgers of Cumberland County. Everett did not ask for forgiveness. Instead, he sent copies of every related record, opened Blackthorne archives to Mr. Price, and met Clara only on matters where honesty had already arrived before him. Spring came slowly to the coast. In Rosevale's glass house, the first white rose opened on a morning of clear blue wind. Clara stood before it with soil on her gloves and sunlight on her face, while beyond the hedges, the road between the two estates lay open, not as a favor, not as a conquest, but as a choice remade each day. Some hearts are not won by grand apologies. Some are approached through truth, patience, and the humility to stand at the gate without demanding entrance.